Today we are continuing our journey through Revelation, and we're going to be getting into a difficult chapter, a little bit of a difficult chapter, but a really good one of my favorites. But to understand it, we've got to understand the role of Mary in salvation history. So that's what I'm going to be arguing for today. And I want to start off by sharing that last week I was out weeding around the church with Laurel, and she had her loppers out and was pruning back some of the bushes. And she confessed to me that she really liked cutting stuff. And I said, I know the feeling. I definitely like trimming back bushes. And shaping them, but it sometimes happens where we can cut too much and kill what we are trying to prune. And in thinking about Mary, I would say, at least in my upbringing, Mary is not somebody that we really talked about. And I think this is a leftover from the Protestant Reformation and saying, oh, Mary is a Catholic thing, talking about Mary. And so we're just going to not talk about her at all. And I think that's a great disservice, both to Mary and to us, because Mary is this important figure in the New Testament. But we have to have eyes to see her, and so I'm hoping to give us those eyes this morning. The past couple weeks, it's been really hot out, and so there's been these really ginormous clouds in the sky that I really love seeing. And as I've been driving, I've been thinking a lot about the clouds and how I haven't been paying attention to them. For a long time. We've been mostly around our house the last year, and even when we do get out, it has not been something on my mind to look up and take in the sky. But we've got a lot of trees around us, and so it's hard to take in the big picture. And so recently I was out with the kids driving, and we could just see for miles in these huge clouds, and it was just beautiful. I went into geography because I love the clouds. I used to say the clouds were my mountains. Anyways, there's a need to look up and see what is right in front of us. And so, again, today I'm hoping to talk about Mary and see how things are right in front of us that maybe we had missed before. And so I have to answer this question, why am I sharing about Mary? Well, in Revelation 12, we read about the woman, this woman clothed with the sun, has a crown of 12 stars, the moon under her foot. Who is this woman? And I bring a couple of assumptions to the table when I'm interpreting this. And one is that, again, I think I've said this before, that John the Apostle is the John that wrote the Gospel and the book of Revelation. Another assumption is that the beloved disciple in the book of John is John himself. And so on the cross, one of Jesus' last 7 words is the phrase, "Woman, behold your son, and son, behold your mother." And then right after that, we read that the beloved disciple took Mary into his home. And so tradition tells us that Mary lived with John for some time. And so that's in the back of my mind in thinking about, okay, if John lived with the mother of Jesus, how would that impact how he writes about her? And so we'll see that this morning. The second thing is seeing that this woman has both a singular and community interpretation. Or collective interpretation. So what do I mean by that? There is an image, scholars kind of debate whether this woman is Israel that gives birth to the Messiah, whether it's the church, whether it's Mary. And I would say that it is, yes, all of these images in Revelation can have multiple meanings. And but I think that there is a singular interpretation. And what do I mean by that? Well, in Revelation 12:9, we read that the serpent or the dragon is the devil or Satan as he's called. And we see also that there is the male child, and we would say that even though this could have so even though the dragon, the serpent, can have a collective interpretation as all evil, there is a singular interpretation that is the devil. The male child that will rule with an iron scepter is Jesus, the Messiah. There is one singular male child, and yet we read earlier in Revelation that Jesus will give to those who conquer the iron scepter, and so it is those other offspring of the woman who conquer. And then finally, we see this woman. So if the dragon is one character that has both a singular and collective interpretation, the male child has both a singular and collective interpretation. It seems to me that the woman would have both a singular and collective interpretation. And so this is why I'm talking about Mary, because I think that there is a lot here about Mary. And so I want us to think about this. For us to understand Mary's role in salvation history, we have to understand what's called typology. So we read throughout the New Testament that in the Old Testament there were types and shadows, and we see Jesus and other things referred to in the New Testament as types of those things in the Old Testament. So Jesus says he is a type of Solomon, he is a type of temple, he is a type of Jonah even. He is a type of Moses, as is often accounted in the Gospels. And then Paul calls him the new Adam, and that'll be important. There's also a lot of parallels with Joseph. But then we also read in 1 Peter where Peter talks about the flood as a type of baptism. So it points towards the reality of baptism. And so we're going to see that Mary plays a type. There are types of the Old Testament that come into the New. And I think this is the key to understanding Mary's role in salvation history and how the New Testament talks about her. So we're going to be talking about 4 types that Mary plays. She is a type of new ark of the covenant. She is a type of Eve. She is a type of Queen Mother. And she is a type of Rachel. And hopefully you guys can follow this. All of this hinges on, for me, why is John bringing up this woman and all of this battle that's going on right now? Well, if you remember the 7th trumpet, in chapter 10, the angel tells John, when the 7th trumpet sounds, the mystery of God will be revealed. It will be known. There's no more delay. And we talked about how the revelation of the mystery of God is Christ in us, the hope of glory. And it's in Ephesians, Paul would say that it's not just Christ in us, but because Christ is in us, it's for Jew and Gentile. That is a mystery of God. But it centers around Christ in us, the hope of glory. And so the 7th trumpet sounds, we hear this proclamation of the kingdom come, which as I was reflecting on this later, was thinking about the shouts in heaven at the birth of Jesus is another way we could interpret Revelation 11 and the talk of the kingdom with the king appearing. And this will impact what we say in Revelation 12. But in any case, so Mary is the first person to have, in a very intimate way, Christ in her. I am not a mom, and so I don't understand this completely, but I do know that there is a bond between a child and its mother. Jesus, the Son of God, grew in Mary's womb. And so there is this sense in which, okay, it makes sense that if the seventh trumpet sounds and there is the revelation of the mystery of God, which is Christ in us, the hope of glory, that John would tell the story of that, how that happens. And it starts with the Ark of the Covenant at the end of chapter 11. He says, "Then God's temple in heaven was open, and with his temple was seen the Ark of the Covenant. And there came flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, an earthquake, and a severe hailstorm." And so why are we seeing the Ark of the Covenant? Well, if you guys remember Raiders of the Lost Ark, the movie, why is there a movie about the Lost Ark? Well, when the temple was destroyed in 587 or 586 BC by the Babylonians, there's no mention of the ark being taken from the temple to Babylon. And so we know that from Ezekiel, the glory cloud left the temple. And so presumably the ark left as well, because the ark was the place where God dwelt. It was the physical place, the thing upon which God overshadowed. And his law, the manna and Aaron's staff were in. The ark was a box that Moses had to build in the wilderness according to the design of God, and as he gives them in Exodus 25. And then in Exodus 40, we see that God comes to overshadow the tabernacle of which the ark is in place. And so with the ark is a significant player in the Old Testament to denote God's presence. So before the temple was built by Solomon, the Israelites would even take the ark into battle as a way to have God's presence with them. And so, but it disappears. And we see from history that in the second temple that was built by Nehemiah, that we read about in Ezra and Nehemiah, the glory cloud never comes back and the ark never comes back. And so at the time of Jesus, or at the time at 70 AD, we read both Josephus and Tacitus, as a Roman historian, both talk about in the Holy of Holies, this mysterious place, there was nothing. It was empty. And so what happened to the ark? There was an expectation that the ark would come about. And why is this? Because in one of the intertestamental books, 2nd Maccabees, it gives this description that Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah, before the Babylonians came, he took the ark and was told by God to take it to Mount Nebo, where Moses was stood up on the mountain to oversee the promised land. And he hid it in a cave, and he wouldn't let anybody see where it was. And when people were asking him, Jeremiah says this, according to the tradition, the Jewish tradition is found in 2nd Maccabees. It says, "The place shall be unknown until God gathers his people together again and shows his mercy. And then the Lord will disclose these things, and the glory of the Lord and the cloud will appear, as they were shown in the case of Moses and Solomon." And so we get this picture in Revelation 11:19 that the ark is in heaven. But what does this mean? Why does John bring this up right before the woman that he sees? It seems like he's talking about very different things. Well, we see in the book of Luke, in Luke's account of the Annunciation and the visitation of Mary to Elizabeth, it portrays Mary as the new ark in very striking ways. So, for instance, the angel tells Mary that the Holy Spirit will come on you and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. So this term overshadow, it's a real technical term that is used very rarely, and it's used in Exodus 40 for the glory of God overshadowing the tabernacle. And so there's a hint there that, okay, Mary is being overshadowed by the presence of God. And then we see as I said, the account of Mary's visitation to Elizabeth. There are so many parallels between the Ark of the Covenant brought into Jerusalem by David in 2 Samuel 6. There's all of these parallels. Mary, just like the Ark, goes into the hill country of Judah and stays there for 3 months. Those are the things, but there's all of these parallels. And then finally, in Luke 2, when Mary presents Jesus before at the temple, Simeon tells her that he can die in peace because he has seen salvation. He says, which you have prepared in the sight of all nations, a light for revelation to the Gentiles in the glory of your people Israel. And so Jesus is the glory of God, but it is brought by Mary. And so this is significant. Luke seems to be telling the story of Jesus' birth, pointing to Mary as a new ark. And this makes sense, of course, because in the Ark of the Covenant, as I said, were the 10 Commandments, which is the covenant, the Old Covenant, the manna, and Aaron's staff. Well, Jesus is the new covenant, is in his flesh, in his body, and he is the bread from heaven, as he says in John 6. He is the bread come down from heaven. And then he is the great high priest, as Hebrews tells us. He is the true high priest. And so Jesus, in this identity, is residing within a woman, her womb. And so the womb is, in a sense, a kind of temple that the ark dwells in, or the person of Jesus dwells in. These things dwell within the ark. Amazing stuff. So I think it makes sense that Mary is the Ark of the Covenant. And so we can make sense, again, why is John telling us this in Revelation 11? Going on from there, we see that Mary is also the new Eve. So as I said, Jesus, both in 1 Corinthians 15 and in Romans, Paul talks about Jesus as the new Adam. And so it makes sense that there is a new Eve, and Mary plays this role. A few months ago when we had the Messianic Jew come share a Passover presentation, he said that at the beginning of every Passover, the woman lights the candle. And that is the start of Passover. And he said the significance of this is that just as Eve was the woman who led her husband into disobedience, the Jews expected a woman to bring forth the light of the world. And so the woman is the one who starts the Passover presentation. And so when we see this reality, we can kind of make sense again of what is going on in Revelation 12, where it seems to be talking about these things from Genesis 1. So in Genesis 1 through 3, Eve is not Eve until after the fall. Before the fall, Eve is only referred to as woman. And it is the woman, right, that the snake is able to deceive the serpent. And then she gives the fruit to Adam. And when all of this is found out by God, of course he knew, but he allows this fall. He gives the curses to the man, the woman, and the serpent. And in Genesis 3:15, he says to the serpent, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." Now, again, this is the first gospel, right? That even though there has been a fall, God is promising that there will be one that will overcome the serpent. And it is the offspring of the woman, the seed of the woman. And so, which is a very strange thing to say, because the seed usually comes from the man. But it is the seed of the woman. Why is that? Because it's hinting at a virgin birth, where the woman is the only, Mary and God are the only two involved in this miraculous birthing process. And so we know who is this woman and who is her offspring. It is Mary. It is Jesus. And so when we get to both John 2, John 19, and Revelation 12, where we see woman, we see that John is referring to Mary in a way that is to present her as a new Eve. So it is Mary at the wedding at Cana, John 2. Jesus refers to her as woman, and we usually take that as like a slight disrespect. But again, we need to see this typology. What is happening? Why is Jesus calling her woman? Well, it is the woman that affects the start of Jesus' ministry, right? Jesus allows his mother to not only give him birth, but be the one that requests his first miracle. John is very clear to point that out, that the wedding at Cana, the water into wine at the wedding, is the first miracle. And it is on behalf of Mary. Jesus says, "It's not my time," and yet Mary's able to ask. And what is Mary's role? She says, "Do what he says." She points back to Jesus. But this is significant because, so again, John seems to be portraying, not just giving this vague woman picture, but presenting Mary as the woman who will give birth to the one who will strike the serpent's head. And this plays out in Revelation 12. The woman gives birth to the male child, and the serpent is cast out or thrown down out of heaven. And so what we see is, I came across this quote from Irenaeus, who's a early Christian, writing in about 180 A.D. He says this wonderful phrase. He says, "The knot of disobedience of Eve was loosed by the obedience of Mary." Right? Mary's the one who says, "Let it be done as you have said." So the knot of disobedience of Eve was loosed by the obedience of Mary. For what the virgin Eve bound fast through unbelief, the Virgin Mary set free by faith. I love that. So in this way, we see this comparison between Mary and Eve, these two women that make different choices. Next is the type of Queen Mother. So if we go back to the kingdom of God, understanding that God was to be king over his people, but they asked for an earthly king, and so God gave them one. And after Saul disappears from the scene and David is put in place, he is the one king, and it's through him that his son will build a temple and sit on the throne forever. And so even though Solomon takes this position, we see that Jesus is a type of Solomon and a son of David and sits on his throne. And so we see in 1 Kings 2 the first mention of a queen mother. And this makes sense that the mother is queen and not a wife. If you guys remember it all, Solomon has 700 wives. Can you imagine trying to figure out who's queen out of those 700 women? But he only has one mom, and so she becomes queen, and she is given a throne. We read in 1 Kings 2, 19. It says, "When Bathsheba went to King Solomon to speak to him for Adonijah, the king stood up to meet her, bowed down to her, and sat down on his throne. He had a throne brought for the king's mother, Bathsheba, and she sat down at his right hand." And so in the kingdom, there is a queen mother. And this phrase, queen mother, it's the Geberah in Hebrew, which means great lady. And the first place we see this phrase is 1 Kings 15. And we see that, again, throughout 1st and 2nd Kings, the mothers of the kings are always usually mentioned. I shouldn't say always, but usually mentioned. So here's an example, 1 Kings 15. "In the 18th year of the reign of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, Abijah became king of Judah. He reigned in Jerusalem 3 years. His mother's name was Maacah, daughter of Abishalom." Okay, so that's his mom. Well, he goes the way of evil, and so is taken out of the throne, and his son Asa takes his place. And it says, "In the 20th year of Jeroboam, king of Israel," this is in 1 Kings 15, verse 9, "Asa became king of Judah, and he reigned in Jerusalem for 41 years. His grandmother's name was Maacah, daughter of Abishalom. Asa did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, as his father David had done. He expelled the male shrine prostitutes from the land and got rid of all the idols his ancestors had made. He even deposed his grandmother, Maacah, from her position as queen mother because she had made a repulsive image for worship of Asherah." And so we see this is a position that was held. And we see this in the prophets. Not only were they given a title, the queen mother, they have a throne we see in Bathsheba, but Jeremiah tells us that the queen mother also has a crown. In Jeremiah 13, Jeremiah is prophesying against the evil in Israel, in Judah. And the Lord says to him, "Say to the king and to the queen mother, 'Come down from your thrones, for your glorious crowns will fall from your heads.'" And so this is important that we see this role of the queen mother. And so when we read in Matthew 1, Matthew is telling the genealogy of Jesus to say that he is the rightful king of Israel. And this isn't explicit, but it is implicit in the text that it means that Joseph, Jesus' adopted dad, would have been king as well. He was in the line of kings. That's how Jesus is able to be king. And Mary is his mother. After telling the birth narrative, it says, this was to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet: "The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel," which means God with us. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel. This is seen as a prophecy of the future king, the anointed one, the Messiah. And so it means that this virgin that is prophesied is the queen mother. And so we see this even down into chapter 2 of Matthew, when the Magi, they go to Herod first and they say, "Where is the one who has been born king of the Jews?" And this is important because Herod is not really Jewish, and he has no legitimate claim on that title. And yet Jesus is the one born king of the Jews. And so when they go and find him, it says in verse 10 of Matthew 2, when they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother, and they bowed down and worshiped him. He is the king, and she is the queen mother. And so we see in Revelation 12, not only is it, again, at the end of chapter 11, we see the new ark, and we see a woman clothed with the sun that points to a new Eve, and the narrative about the serpent, the dragon. We also see that she is crowned on her head. This is a position of authority. This is the queen mother's role. But this is, and lastly, I'll just say from Luke 1, when Mary goes and visits Elizabeth, what does she say? She says, "Why am I so favored to have a visit from the mother of my Lord?" It's the word Kyrios. It means king. It means Lord. And Elizabeth counts herself blessed for having been visited by the mother of the Lord, the King. She is the Queen Mother. And I think we need to see that if we're going to understand what's going on in Revelation 12. And this woman, heavenly figure that has a crown. To the last point, Mary as the new Rachel. So what is the significance of Rachel? And why do I have this in there? Well, a couple things. If you guys remember, Rachel is the favored wife of Joseph, of Jacob, I'm sorry. And Jacob works 7 years for her and flies by because he's so in love. But then Jacob ends up marrying Leah and has to work another 14 years for Rachel. And in this battle between sisters and favoritism, Rachel's womb is not open. And it isn't until Joseph is born that Jacob has a son through Rachel. And so Jacob favors Joseph. You guys remember Joseph has the coat of many colors. He is the favored one as the child of Rachel. And then Rachel has a second child, Benjamin, but she actually dies in the process of giving birth. And so, in kind of the Jewish mindset, Rachel then becomes this sympathetic, motherly figure, especially to those that are going through trial. She dies in Bethlehem, and so we see her show up in Matthew 2, which will come into play in this last section, or in Revelation 12. Because if you guys remember, Herod hears from the wise men that the king is born, and as I read earlier, and so the wise men don't go back to the king, to King Herod, and so he goes to Bethlehem, has all the children killed, all the male children killed below the age of 2. And Matthew quotes a prophecy from Jeremiah and says that it's fulfilled, that Rachel, let me read it real quick. A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning. Okay, so a voice is heard, there's weeping and great mourning, and who is this? It's Rachel, weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are no more. And so Rachel, again, like I said, is this figure, a motherly figure for Israel, and one that has gone through sorrow, refusing to be comforted. And it says this is fulfilled when Mary goes to, Mary and Joseph and Jesus go to Egypt and escape, but the other children are killed in Bethlehem. And so this is kind of an important thing. So we're going to go through, okay, how does Mary fill a type of Rachel? Well, this comes about also because of all of the ways that Jesus is a type of Joseph. So just a few things that Joseph and Jesus have in common. Joseph is the firstborn and beloved son of Jacob. Jesus is the beloved son of God. We hear that on the Mountain of Transfiguration and at the baptism. This is my son whom I love. In him I am well pleased. Joseph is sold to Gentiles for 20 pieces of silver by his brother, one of the 12 brothers, Judah. Jesus is sold to Gentiles for 30 pieces of silver and betrayed by Judas, one of the 12 disciples. Joseph is exalted to the right hand of Pharaoh and rules the kingdom, and thus provides salvation for both the Israelites and for Gentiles when the famine came. And Jesus is exalted to the right hand of the Father and rules the kingdom and provides salvation to both Jew and Gentile. And of course then, if Jesus is a new Joseph, then Mary also parallels Rachel. And specifically as this figure of a suffering mother. But the way that this comes about in Revelation 12 is we see at the beginning that this woman is clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. Now, most scholars point out the similarities to Joseph's dream, that the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars would bow down to him. And so Jacob says to Joseph, does this really mean that your mother and I and your brothers will bow down? and his mother is Rachel, right? So there's this sun, moon, and stars imagery that Rachel is a part of as well. But then also we see this birth pain. Now, this isn't a normal word for birth pains. The word for, it says she was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. And this word for pain isn't, elsewhere in Revelation, it's translated as torture or torment. And so it's not a normal word that you would use for birth. And so what I want to show is that the cross is a type of birth that Mary participates in. So what do I mean by this? Well, Jesus describes in John's gospel his own passion, the cross, as a type of labor. Just as a labor or a woman goes through great pain to give birth, so too does the Son of Man. He talks about going to the cross. And so, and then when we get to the crucifixion scene in the book of John, John 19, we see it as a type of birth. So, and Mary seems to give birth to a second son in this moment. So it says, near the cross of Jesus, this is chapter 19, verse 25. Near the cross of Jesus stood his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother there and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to her, "Woman, here is your son." And to the disciple, "Here is your mother." From that time on, the disciple took her into his home. So this would have been like a legal form, a last will and testament that Jesus declares from the cross. This actually happens. This is an adoption scene. Mary does become John's mom, and John becomes her son. But this language, "Woman, behold your son," brings to mind we just had our fifth child, Seth, almost 5 years or five months ago, and he was born. And what did the nurses do? They give Becky her son and say, "Here's your son." And so this language is describing a type of birth, and but it is through an extreme torment. Simeon, if you remember from Luke 2, when Jesus is presented at the temple, says to Mary that this child will pierce her heart with a sword. And so this moment where Jesus is on the cross, he's being tortured, he's being crucified, he's being killed. His mom is right there witnessing it. And I can't even imagine the pain of loss, of sorrow. Mary has not only had Jesus in her womb, she's nursed him, she's raised him. She has been his mother. And so to see her in this moment of pain and sorrow is a big deal. And so I think this is what I want to end on. Why do I bring this up? Well, in particular, I've heard Ernie say a decent amount in communion meditations that he really loves Peter because he sees himself so much in Peter. And I do as well. Peter's the one that, acts before he thinks, speaks before he thinks, says yes before he knows what the commitment is entailed. He does stuff, and that's relatable. And so the thing is that when we don't have Mary as a character that we can reflect on her life, we lose out on a woman who has been through great suffering and kept the faith. This is the most important part, is even as she's going through this sorrow, right? She does get a new son in John on the cross. But also she's there at Pentecost. She's there in the upper room prior to Pentecost praying with the disciples. And so we know from this that she did not lose hope. She did not lose her faith even through her deepest trial. And I think for us that's a really needed thing. As we go through our trials, we need this example. I heard a few weeks ago this statement that Christians are disoriented when they meet the cross. And it seems to me that this is a very true statement in my own life. That I feel like if I'm following Jesus, then things should be okay. And yet, this is the way that things God has allowed them to be. I think about Mary having this same thought. She has this child. He's promised to be the king, the anointed one, the Messiah. Gets this huge birth announcement literally in the heavens. Angels are singing. Trumpets are blasting. A king has been born. And so I'm sure there was this sense in which, okay, things are going to be okay. We have the Messiah. We have the anointed one. We have the king has come. And yet, not only does Jesus have to go through the cross, but Mary has to endure it as well as a mom. And so I think that speaks into our lives. If we really think about the crosses in our lives, the suffering that we go through, we have this sense of disorientation in it. But it's in this disorientation that I think that we can be reoriented to what is beyond the suffering. So just as Jesus predicted, right? He said, I will be buried for 3 days and come back. And so he endured his pain because of the joy set before him. I just think about Mary's own sense as well, that she was able to endure this, knowing that salvation would come through this way. It was told her, this child is going to pierce your heart with a sword. There's going to be pain, and yet the joy of salvation, of the king having come, I think sustained her. And I think it needs to sustain us as well. So next week we'll get into the bigger picture of Revelation 12. And until then, God bless.